Hello, selectors, and welcome back to the Life First Podcast. I'm Andrew. We're rounding out the centers for the Fisone decks that we can be playing. And the last one is Yuzuki. Or, I don't know, it might come up sooner on than the last one. But Yuzuki is a bit of an interesting case here. Yuzuki's, when I first looked at it, was the one that was the least interesting to me because it felt like it was basically just red deck go burr, kind of what it wanted to be. And then the more I ended up sort of like talking with my play group, Burstiff, about it, specifically Rue, who got top 8 with Luke in the last GP, the more they had sort of this cool spicy lean towards it. And yeah, you guys know me, I'm sort of allergic to spice over here. I like tried and true methods, but this came out as something I think that could potentially be pretty good. So I wanted to show off two different versions of the deck. One that I think is always going to sort of hit the mark that you're trying to do, and one that's probably needs a little bit more time in the oven to cook. And you guys might be able to take it and cook it a little further. But let's talk about the first one, which is just the aggro version, right? So you've got this new Yuzuki that's coming out. It's got the ability of, when it enters, you can crush a card in your own life cloth, which is, a little suicidal, but, that's sort of how these decks function. And then you can put one card from your opponent's life cloth into the trash. This is pretty unique in the fact that so far all of the ways to affect your opponent's life cloth, like with red, has been through crushing it, right? Which is it stinks on two different ways. One, if you end up going too fast, right, and then suddenly, sometimes that happens, right? Sometimes you do end up getting a lot of damage in. Crushing an opponent's life cloth might not be useful because it might be too late, right? You want to damage the opponent, and that's kind of within the realm of red a little bit, but also white. And then also you're giving them enter, which always kind of stinks. You're crushing a life cloth, so you get a trigger, off of that, and that kind of blows too. So like, what if you hit an Akufuku off of it? Oh no, the whole game's ruined now. I mean, it would be ruined. So having it put into the trash is something kind of that red's been looking for a while, right? Until this point, pretty much every deck that was trying to speed along and also deny resources a little bit and triggers would use a refresh. So you still theoretically could use a refresh in this deck, get like double down on your stuff. It's a little harder to do without actually supporting the Elrig deck. I would say if you wanted to try to do that, you'd probably want to run Urith as your center, get a 4 on the first go around, and then play something in the main deck that gets 10 when it attacks, like a Phalaris. Or you could do the Urith and Phalaris, or Urith and level 2 Urith get 8, and then you only need to do about 4 to 6 when you're attacking, which happens to be a number that Dona can put out very easily. So I think there's also an option to go just nuclear and super dash. But I think there are more reliable dash decks out there than this, so that's not why I was necessarily pushing it towards that direction. Then you've got the once per turn ability of, as long as there are 2 or less cards in your life cloth, you will be you'll be able to play a colorless and a red, and then give target red Signy on your field Assassin. Then you get the same thing that you always get with all of these Fisone, which you get the Fisone spells that you can cast. Generally speaking, I think you're probably either always going to be getting the things that draw you a card, or the things that do damage to the opponent, right? Like, are able to open up a lane. Depending on what is in your hand and what you need, I think that's probably the 2 modes you're going to go with. I don't think you're ever really going to get a card with this type of deck. The next one, I actually think you'd be getting a card, the next deck that I'm going to show you. But I think generally speaking, you're just going to be pushing the damage output. I looked at trying to see if I can make this a non-Dishona deck, and I basically couldn't. It's not necessarily that. It's just the more and more red cards I put in there, and yes, you can do sort of this mono red build, and I don't suggest it. I don't think mono red in the main deck is the way to go. I don't think there's any reason to do that. you only need X amount of lane opening. After that, any more amount of lane opening you have is redundant and kind of like bad for your deck. So you want to do other things like, I don't know, have enter because this card costs 2 enter per turn, basically, right? Or have cards in hand because you need to fill out lanes in order to do anything. So you end up in the scenario where this sort of aggressive deck either wants to be black leaned so it can get cards in hand, or blue leaned so it can get cards in hand, but not enough that it's really going to be that effective. But you do want enter in this deck because of the costs associated with it. So I think you end up like wanting that kind of a deck. The key with this deck, and this is going to be with both decks, the key is to try to put your own life cloth down to 3 when you grow to your level 3. So that way you crush your own life cloth, and then you're at 2, right? And then you have your effect, and you get to push for damage that way. I think that's the trick with this deck, is to try to do that. It's a little scary because you're basically always on the nice edge by doing that. But in order to pull that off, there's basically 2 things you should be doing. 1, you should be setting up Signy that die very easily, right? So that you can still make the opponent, like, you're not opening up the holes. You're not going to be like, I'm just not going to fill out my lanes, or I'm going to play Signy that kill themselves. No, you're going to play things that die easily, but you're still going to make your opponent commit to opening those lanes, right? So that they're using their resources. You are wanting to do that with levels 1 and 2 specifically, right? Because that's the time to take the damage, and then you don't really want to take damage after that because you'll lose the game. It also means that you probably are going to do something that you don't normally do in Wixoss, and you're going to hold off growing your assists, your level 2 assists anyways, for a little bit, right? So you're probably not growing your level 2 assist until turn 3 defense, which is always pretty scary. Because of that, theoretically, you could play a deck that has double 2 stops in it, right? And be able to start doing more damage blocking. But you also could do the classic stuff of just one block here, and what I ended up going with, which was Mel Invisible. Look, Mel Invisible is really good. It also doubles as a guard save, and when you're so dangerously low on life cloth, I think that's pretty important. And then you've got the Eldora on stage combo with drawing 2 cards and just being able to down something and drawing extra cards. I think this deck, basically, the more I was like putting this deck together, I was like, this is a dash deck, so I should be doing the dashy things, right? I've got a flat throw right here also, so like I should be ending up in that kind of world. So I optimized going, I needed to enter for my abilities. This is a little low on red too. And then I also wanted more cards in hand, so I ended up going with the Eldora stage here. The Song of Wixoss actually helps you get guards really easily, which is very, very nice, and works well with Flat Throw. It's just common tech, I think, that we've all known pre-Dona. The other one is Connect. So this is a new piece that's coming out for this set, and I think it's very, very strong. Basically, for 3 enter, you get to pick the following, you get to do 3, right, of these. You have to wait till your opponent's level 3, then you can pull this trigger on it, and you can pick 3. Of your 3 of 4 choices that you have are, you can either target opponent's Signy on the opponent's field and vanish it, point blank, no muss, no fuss, no level costs, no power amounts. If your opponent's level is level 3 or higher, you can put 3 cards from their they put 3 cards from their enter zone into the trash, so you enter burn them 3. You can discard all the cards in your hand, and if you do, you get to draw 4. I think that's good in Dash specifically, because then you can also play that with Song of Wixoss immediately afterwards to get up to the required 7 that you need to be at in order to crush a life cloth there. And then you can also discard 2 cards from your hand. If you do, you get to crush a opponent's life cloth. So there's a lot of fast moving damage here. You can crush from your L-Rig, you can crush from your Flat Throw, you can crush with this as well. So you've got a lot of ways to just like machine gun down your opponent's enter. This is the closest we've gotten to a burn deck, I think, in a long time in Wixoss. So that's the L-Rig deck, right? That sort of gives you the solidified base of what you're doing here. After that, I did put it in the world of Dona. just because I think the Dona decks are very aggressive, but then allow you to have very flexible enter costs to do other effects with. And that's something I distinctly wanted, right? So of the non-Dona, let's just go over non-Dona real quick, because that's something that I think people might need a refresher on. We've got Nobunaga. Nobunaga grows on top of a red Signy. You can give it Assassin, you can give it Double Crush. Those two things stack well together, so you end up being able to do even more damage output. I don't think it's super necessary with all of the amount of Double Crush we have, or all of the crushing we have here, but, you know, there are people who are playing right now things like Urith, Aura, I think is what it is, that gets you back your, gets you more cards in your life cloth. So, you know, yeah, it's great there. Flathrow gets Assassin on its own by discarding your hand, and arguably you probably won't have a hand when you're doing your final turns. Tamago on the meanwhile gets you up on cards, right? You can play a Tamago and draw a card immediately. Yeah, you probably miss out on its second ability unless you're trying to go, like, this is turn 3 and you're trying to go to turn 4. I like it because of that ability to go up immediately. I found that the Harana Dash decks of yesteryear really wanted to basically have cards that replace themselves when they're played, so that way they can maintain that hand size that they're trying to go for. A Bang, because again, you want to not get shot down by Exia. There is enough card draw in this deck that theoretically one-ofs should show up, and you can hold one-ofs in your hand even through discard. Firecracker, because it's just simply one of the best cards in the format. There's a new red version of Firecracker that exists that basically allows you to, but you have to more or less play mono red to pull that off. So I'm not a huge fan of it. Wawolf, I love Wawolf with Firecracker because they basically fight at two different axes, right, of the lower walls Signy that can play. Someone's playing at something that has Shadow level 3. Okay, cool. Wawolf gets over it. Doesn't matter, you know. So I like Wawolf always being the partner there. Plus, it's worth mentioning that Wawolf lends to green. Green lets you run Mel Invisible. Mel Invisible lets you run Mel Revise, which then lets you have more enter for your stuff, which lets you do more red damage things that you wouldn't normally be able to do, be a little bit more greedy with your enter. So yeah, it's just, it all feeds into each other. Red and green really feed well into each other for aggro. Ivy's there, giving you, again, more enter, like we said, is important. I think level 2s are actually pretty important in this deck, too. They get more important than the second version of the deck that make. Love it. Love it here is not necessarily for enter burn. Yes, we have a piece that can enter burn, so plus with Love It can mean that we're doing a good amount of enter burn. Red doesn't, like, red aggro doesn't necessarily always do the job of stopping enter from being very good. But it can color screw, and if you can stop a 3-stop and turn it into a 2-stop, you're gonna win the game, you know, like off of that kind of thing. We've got Carnivals here. I think Carnivals is actually more important in this than the Ano, which I do have one of somewhere. Yeah, the Ano. Ano allows you to attack up, which is quite nice, but that's better in decks that are trying to run out people's hands. Carnival here actually is a nice insurance policy since you're going so low on your life cloth. You need to have insurance policies to make sure that you just don't die, right? That's the weakness of this deck, is that you could go so aggressive, and then all the opponent needs to do is put out like a medium amount of lane opening, and then they'll win the game. So this is a little bit of insurance policy on it. Doesn't save you from damage, you know, necessarily, but it helps. The last one here is Broom. Like I said, I think refilling your hand is really important. Plus, there is a certain amount of toolboxing in this deck that we want to be doing, because there's a couple cards that in the non-burst stuff that we're kind of running a slim amount of. Nobunaga, Flathrow, and the Tamago, and the Bang, to be like, these are cards that I'd like to see later in the game, and depending on the matchup, I would want to see them more than others, and Broom helps you kind of do that. Same thing with Emergence. Emergence helps you do that, but in this case, it also is enter. Emergence is just one of the best cards that you've been playing, plus it has a really good life burst in this deck specifically, because, yeah, you've got the firecrackers, but yeah, you also have Nobunaga, which can kill things, right? Like, you can pull it out of your trash, put it on something, and then kill something 8,000 or less. And Love It, which kills stuff point blank as well. Broom, which can draw you some cards. So there's some uses for it. I was running out. I'm gonna be honest with you guys. I was running out of things here to place that were red and also life bursty. So I put down the Ano. It's got a good life burst. I put down the Lalaru. I think this is actually a pretty good life burst. Yes, you can enter burn. There's 5 spells in here, so there is a chance to do some pretty good enter burn. I think level 2s were kind of important to put out. And then following that, I also had Diabride as the last one. Diabride's a weird one. Diabride is like, you never really have a field full of red for Diabride anymore. That time in Wixoss is past. But the fact that it itself says it enter burns the opponent if someone touches it on your turn, and usually there's a lot of down stuff, so it will enter burn the opponent based on that, and then on their turn, they have to open a lane. In order to open a lane, they probably need to kill the Diabride, and then because they need to kill the Diabride, they burn another enter. So it has functionality there. It's not like it's going to be a complete blanket protection, but you can engineer a situation where, like, you know, Diabride's the first one to attack in a turn, which means that, like, or maybe Diabride's like the last one to attack in a turn, so if it gets targeted by a life burst, it ends up getting you your sweet win off of it, right? And maybe attack with Diabride seconds, and you leave the last red card for last. Maybe you only had 2 on the field at that point. My point is, you can engineer situations where Diabride's good, but it takes some actual thought to do. Plus, it just helps you with the filtering through your deck, right? The ability to discard a card, look at the top 2, put 1 in your trash, put 1 in your hand, means that you are going to make sure that you're hitting the splits, hitting the spells that you need, hitting the one-ofs that you need in this deck. So it's just a good consistency piece for red. That's why it's really important for red. I think this deck is probably pretty good. Probably pretty like, it wins or it doesn't win, which is truly a dash thing. I think it's a little one-layered, like, it has some enter burn, but the enter burn isn't necessarily a key functionality to it. It has, just other than that, it just does damage. So if you want to play a cool dash deck and a cool variation on dash deck, I think this is fine. What Rue was working on actually interests me more, and I think you guys could probably take this and go further with it. And if you guys have any thoughts about how to go further with it, comment down below.
Hey everyone, Rue here. I'm just coming in at the tail end of this video to talk quickly about an alternative version of Yuzuki that you can play in this P14 and even into the Blue Archive metagame, because I think Yuzuki is, as a center, is very, very flexible, just like pretty much all of the P14 centers. And she allows you to do some things that are pretty unique among all of the meta decks that we've seen over the past at least 2 years of English Wixoss. So I just thought it would be cool to talk about this unique deck. If you are someone that feels like, yeah, you've gotten tired of the metagame, I know I personally have gotten pretty burnt out on the kind of Wixoss decks that are generally strong, you know, like your discard or your dash or your very high interaction decks. This deck isn't super interactive, which I know will turn some players off, but I think it feels a lot more like your homebrew custom, like, I want to play my favorite cards kind of decks. And you'll see definitely as I get more into the meat of this deck, you'll see that there's some very unique cards that you probably haven't seen in decks before. But this deck has actually been performing very strong when compared to, like, your throw all the favorite card together decks, because it's taking games off of some very good players on some very good decks. I've played a bunch of it. I think the cracks are showing a little bit in it, but I think, you know, with adjusted play and ratios, like, this is not the perfect version of the deck. I've already made some changes beyond what I'm going to be showing here, but I think this is give a good baseline on a very alternative and interesting playstyle to pretty much anything in the deck, anything else in the metagame, including other Yuzuki decks. And so the idea of the deck is built around Yuzuki, obviously, and it's built around Sunspot memory. And if you're someone that bought a lot of Dona, you're going to love this deck because it has basically no new cards from P14 other than Yuzuki. So this is the only new card that you're going to have to pick up, along with the Fasane Magic, obviously. But it's pretty easy to, like, to get into if you are just starting your collection. The main thing is that Exia is basically a requirement in the deck, but if you already have Exias because it's been a strong card for a while and will continue being a strong card for a while, then just you can throw this deck together with pretty much anything else that you already have. It has a bunch of 1-ofs, but these 1-ofs can all be substituted for other 1-ofs, and we'll talk about them in a moment here. But I want to talk a little bit about what the deck is built around, which is Sunspot Memory. Yuzuki has this line of text. It's her main action, which is that you can pay red in a colorless, and only if you have 2 or fewer life cloth, you can give a red Signy on your field assassin. And this basically means that you can open a hole every turn for 2 enter. And that doesn't sound too amazing, but it also means that you can do it regardless of what your opponent's playing. So Atoms is a very popular deck. H2O is a very hard Signy to remove. This deck doesn't care about H2O. You just assassin through it. Another example is Exia. Normally, Exia is a pretty good answer to sort of these open 1, open 2 decks because it forces you to have a way to remove multiple things. You don't have to worry about it because you can open holes without ever targeting. So Yuzuki just helps you get consistent damage every turn without worrying about what your opponent's doing. And it can even be comboed with cards like Yuzuki here. I didn't pull up Yuzuki, but she basically lets you vanish an additional Signy whenever she deals damage. So she can help in the mid to late game to get you additional holes just for breaking a hole with Assassin. Importantly, it can only give red Signy Assassin, and there's quite a few of non-red Signy in the deck, right? But it's still good enough that your opponent will probably have to find some sort of answer, and you'll probably have a red Signy every single turn. But because it can only be activated if you have 2 or fewer cards in life cloth, or rather, you only get the assassin if you have 2 or fewer cards on your life cloth, you kind of are encouraged to take damage early. And that's kind of where Sunspot Memory comes in. Because really what this card says is gain an additional 2 life. But because it doesn't actually give you additional life cloth, it doesn't stop you from activating Yuzuki, which is awesome because it means you can take a ton of damage early. You don't have to really worry about, I didn't draw servants, or I didn't have the right, I didn't want to have to use my assist this early, but I kind of have to. You want to take damage early. So you don't have to worry about those unlucky scenarios in the early and mid game because you want to get to 2 life cloth as quickly as possible. Generally, you do still want to use servants and activate assists if it means staying at 3 life cloth before growing, because you have that enter effect to crush a life cloth, which does hurt your opponent's life. And you do want access to the potential for a good burst here, because bursting an Emergence or a Broom or Palebi burst can help a lot if your opponent has double Exia boards. I know we just talked about being able to assassin through them, but there is still removal in the deck, and it would be nice to get rid of Exia. So Palebi helps against that, same with H2O and other similar defensive Signy like that, if you do burst it with Yuzuki's enter effect here. The other assists in the Elrig deck are going to be Mel. The Mel line is just extremely solid into Sona. You're already running 4 Emergence. You're running 4 Wobbles as your aggressive level 1s, and you run the double bang. So you have a lot of green already, and Mel just helps get the correct enter when you need it. This deck runs a lot of white in order to support Sunspot, so you kind of need to be able to have the right enter. You need red to pay for Yuzuki's effect. You need green to pay for Bang's effect. You kind of need Desona to pay for Wallwolf and Fire. Well, I guess it doesn't help Firecracker, but Wallwolf and Love It. And so there's a lot of different costs that the deck requires. Revise just helps with all of that. There's alternatives to the Revise Invisible line. If you want to be more aggressive, you can play Mama, which is a new assist. But I think the Revise Invisible, if you've played pretty much any deck that runs green in the past 2 years or year and a half since this card released, you've been running this card because this is probably one of the best assist lines in the game. And the only real upfront cost is that you have to run green in your deck. The other assist I'm running right now is Tamago. I could definitely see an argument for other blue draw assists or even white draw assists, but I think Tamago is just really solid. It gives you access by playing a blue to Song of Wixoss, which I'll talk about in a sec. But more than that, I think just the free down is very strong. I could definitely see an argument for Madoka in this slot, but we're not running any blue in our main deck, so we can't pay for the discard unless we have a servant. Which is just a little too unlikely, so I'd rather have the opportunity to draw 2 additional cards if need be. I could definitely see an argument for Eldora as well. I don't like having to take damage in order to block stuff, but Eldora is generally very strong. I'm not a big fan of the assist anyway, but if you're someone who likes Eldora, I think she might actually be better in this slot. And lastly, I think the other option is Umer. Excuse me. Umer is very solid. The Umer Clear line is very solid. Elrig Freeze is nice. I'm going to talk a little bit later about this, but the Servant, you can actually go down on Servants in this deck and kind of get away with it. The version I've been playing has only been running 2 Servants. Or the version I've been playing most recently. I don't think it's better than 4 Servants. Having the ability to block Elrig attacks is very important, especially in certain matchups, but Umar can help with that a lot, so I can definitely see an argument for Umar as well. But right now I've just been running Tamago. And the reason I'm running Tamago is partly to get access to Song of Wixoss. You need a blue Elrig in order to play it, even though color rules don't exist anymore because it has this use condition. And you might be wondering, like, this card almost is objectively worse than Xenocluster because it's draw 3 with a downside, but it has a couple upsides on top of Xeno that I really like. The first is that it's main phase timing. Sometimes you don't realize that you need to draw cards until it's your main phase, and you see what you have access to. That's not super important, but it's definitely an upside over Xeno. Like, being able to play the cards that you draw from Song of Wixoss is pretty big. The second is because you'll be going empty-handed a lot, or you'll be discarding down to 1. Like, you'll just have 1 card in your hand when you pass to your opponent. And the problem is that a good player is not going to discard you cards if they know that it'll activate Xeno. So in order to be able to actually consistently invisible when you have 0 or 1 card in hand, you kind of need a way to draw 2 cards during your opponent's turn, and Song of Wixoss just enables that. We don't really have major enter issues, at least not that I've seen so far, but I haven't played against too much enter burn decks, or enter denial. Enter denial doesn't do a good job of stopping you from having enter because they still kind of have to deal damage to you, and you'll see why we don't really spend enter in a bit. But generally, we'll have the enter to use these 2 effects, even into like a Levitt or something. And Song of Wixoss just helps get that 3rd effect, pretty much guaranteed. And one thing that's really nice is that if you're at 0 life cloth, Sunspot Memory gives you a barrier, 2 barriers, right? Elrig and Signy barrier. And Invisible will block 2 damage. The most damage that most decks can deal in a single turn is 4. And because of that, just by having 2 enter and your barriers up with Sunspot Memory, Song of Wixoss, no matter what was in your hand, always means that your opponent cannot kill you. There's some decks that can deal 5 damage, think your Haranas or your Tamas, but they usually have to put a lot of effort to do that anyway. So it's nice to have that security of, like, I can live 1 more turn with Invisible, Song, and Sunspot Memory. The other reason that we run Sunspot Memory is the other reason that we run Song of Wixoss is because we're running Midoriko. The deck kind of wins off of dealing 1 to 2 damage for free every turn without having your opponent really being able to respond. And so if you're playing against slower decks, you'll pretty much just win because you're dealing more damage than they are while still being just as defensive. But if you're playing against faster decks, Midoriko helps stifle a lot of the game plans that require a lot of Signy attacks. It's fine. I think the ability to activate it with Song of Wixoss is very important. That's another reason to run it over Xeno. Although Xeno, you technically can still activate it if you play Xeno during the beginning of your attack phase. But Midoriko is just a solid card. I think it's definitely one of those cards that you could definitely trade out for something else, but it has its moments where it's useful. I definitely think it's one of the weaker cards in the deck, and taking it out could definitely allow you to run things other than Song. Like, you could maybe get away with Innocent Battle if you're in a meta where Chaos is very popular, new piece, very popular piece, very powerful piece. Innocent Battle is probably the best answer. I'd say it's not as strong of an answer as it was to Ultra Superheroes because you can't play it on the main phase, during your turn after the Chaos, but it's still pretty solid on the turn that your opponent chaoses if they don't actually mill you out on the spot. It's pretty decent deck or answer to chaos and pretty decent alternative. The downside is that you only draw 1 card, so it doesn't help you consistently activate Mel, but that's not a huge issue. And of course, the other alternative is Xeno. And I would only really run those as you take out Midoriko, but one of the upsides of Xeno is if you do play it during your attack phase, to enter charge 1, it can enable Osakitsune. Osakitsune does have the ability to be activated by a few other cards, namely Fasane Magic Green does a good job of Fasane Magic Jade does a good job of activating Osakitsune. Osakitsune can also get activated by your emergences as well as your emergence burst. If you hit an emergence burst off of Yuzuki's enter, that does enter charge you 1, and that can give you access to Osakitsune being turned on as well. It's a solid card. If you've played Osakitsune before, you know all the tricks, but it works well in this deck as a way to get more damage without having to commit too much upfront costs. And I think the best card for that purpose, and this is probably my favorite card in the entire deck right now, is Komainu. This card has been super duper overperforming in the deck as a way to basically get free additional hulls. When you combo it with Ana Uzu, which we're also running 4 of, it gets plus 5,000 on attack. And one thing that I really like about the Ana Uzu in this deck is that there's a lot of non-Dona. So, for example, you can attack with any of these cards first, like get your Midoriko activation or get your Lion double attack, which we'll talk about in a sec, without taking away the ability to get that second hull with Komainu. And so Ana Uzu plus Komainu is just such a solid board. You know, Komainu, it lets you vanish anything with 8k or less while you have an Ana Uzu on the field, basically, which just makes it extremely strong. The last 2 cards I kind of want to talk about are Lion and Bookmark. Bookmark is surprisingly strong. Similar to what I was saying about Invisible, the ability to decide your enter and to sort of reset your enter is really nice. And this discard effect, which is kind of a joke, like this whole card is kind of a joke, but even this discard effect is decent because we have access to Fasane Magic Blue, which does discard cards during our turn consistently. It does mean that you can actually consistently activate Bookmark during your turn to get that plus 2,000 power, which can be relevant against search and assist signups. So it's not a bad card. Importantly, it's pretty much there as a 5th spell, in addition to the emergencies, to activate Lion. Lion gets awakened when you cast your 3rd spell in a turn. Fasane Magic does count as casting a spell, and this can give you the extra push of damage that your opponent might not be playing around. I've won maybe 2 or 3 games off of Lion Bookmark combo. It's not great, honestly. Like, if there's any other combo I would cut both of those, because you can run maybe another Exia on the Bookmark spot, and then you can run maybe another Yuzuki in this Lion spot. It's not great, if I'm being honest, but it does do things that you can't do otherwise, which I think is really the big overarching narrative with this deck. You're able to do things that you can't do in other decks, because you just have access to so many options. Yuzuki by herself gives you a lane every turn, and Komainu gives you a second lane every turn. And because of that, it means that you're able to basically force slower decks to have to race you because your damage is so consistent, or force faster decks to basically overwhelm you. I will say some shortcomings with this deck that I've already noticed is that the lack of a way to mill out your opponent is pretty rough, because you can't pressure Lifecloth in the same way that other Open 2 decks do. But it hasn't been too big of an issue. The bigger issue is mostly that faster decks kind of eat you alive if they're also interacting. And the metagame that was right before this one, P13, was full of fast decks that also interact. Xeno maybe solves this a little bit. Innocent Battle maybe solves this a little bit. I'm not 100% sure. You might want to make huge changes to ratios in the deck, but I think this deck is pretty solid as is versus a lot of the future metagame. I'd say some major changes I would make based on your metagame is obviously the pieces, if you think these would be better in your locals metagame. I would also probably put an additional Komainu out for a Firecracker. Firecracker is a solid card, but if you're playing against a lot of discard, it's not really a usable card. And obviously, you can replace the Lovets and Bangs. Like, Bang is probably a requirement, but Lovet isn't as much of a requirement if you don't have those cards. I know they're pretty difficult to find and get a hold of. But yeah, I think the deck is just really cool. And even if you don't play like this exact list, obviously, I have diverged from this list by the time I'm recording this video. So even if you don't play this exact list, I hope that this gives you inspiration to look at Yuzuki in a new light, to take the Sunspot Yuzuki, or even other pieces such as Splash Field, which is a new piece, or even look at Chaos or Unrest or Blue Knight Show, and see that there's other options for Yuzuki just than Mono Red, which I know is like generally the approach that most players take to it. Importantly, I guess the last thing I can add is that this deck really makes you feel like you're solving puzzles every turn, and because of that, you kind of have to be a player who's able to analyze game states in a very holistic way. You have to be able to look at the game in a way that you might not have had to look at the game before, but I think that really helps you improve as a player in a way that playing just a standard list wouldn't. So I hope you guys find this deck list interesting, and hope that it inspires you to uh, play more Wheatcross, because I know it has helped me. So yeah, enjoy the list.